So we'd now like to welcome our next witness, Claire O'Connor from South Australia, Adelaide. Claire. And welcome. Yeah, well, I'm sitting here, Jocelynne, Scutt, with Dr. Helen Pringle from the University of New South Wales, where she's an associate professor, Mary Kerr, who's from Darwin, where she's a police officer in the Northern Territory Police, and Kerry Heubel, who was the first executive officer to the Women's Advisory Council that was set up in New South Wales under the Wren government at the end of the 1970s. And she's, of course, a linguist and a teacher of English as a second language now. So over to you, Claire. Well, now, would you like to, we understand that the issues that you would like to talk about are using the law to achieve social justice and change and making those in power accountable. Now, this fits in very well with our first witness who was talking about the processes in the family court and how her experience and the expertise that she's built up in the field because of her work with others, with survivors of criminal assault at home and other forms of domestic violence. In their estimation, justice is not what's being accessed, if any access to the family court is being achieved at all, in that area. Now, I know that you have worked on immigration matters, on matters relating to...
Jocelynne, I probably do about 50% family now.
Oh, good.
I do personal injuries matters for victims of sexual and physical assault. I do inquests into deaths in custody. I've done 2 in the last couple of years in relation to Aboriginal deaths, 1 female, 1 male. And I don't do immigration. I do personal injuries claims for detainees. So people that have not had their who've been breach of duty of care in relation to the care, especially for people in long-term detention. So they're the kind of areas I do. I do a lot of crime for climate activists as well. So I'm in the middle of doing a lot of cases here because it's a bit of an issue in South Australia at the moment.
Right. Well, now, these 2 issues, the access to justice is really, would be wonderful to hear you speak on, and also the environmental issue, because climate change is impacting on women in particular, in particular ways, and it's often overlooked. They talk about climate change as if it's just a universal coverage for everyone. But so if you could talk about the access to justice and the environmental aspects that you're working on, that would be appreciated.
So I think the important thing is to start systemically with the fact that women in the justice system just don't achieve the same. We just don't have the same access, whether that is people who are at the upper level. So you're talking about people in the profession. We're not in the boardrooms, not on the bench. We're not so much in the bar. We don't get the money. And then in the courtrooms, you don't get believed. In family court and in crime, there's this view that you're making it up for an ulterior purpose, although no one ever questions why someone would put themselves through the legal system for some purpose. So that's the starting point. So that there's an extra hurdle always, not just accessing justice because of a range of reasons why you can't get justice, but when you are able to get an advocate or to get before the courts or before tribunals, your case is not as seen as valid. There's got to be witnesses. There's got to be support around what occurred to you before your case is accepted, and that's across every area. So that's across, and then that applies also to everyone who is not white. So the hurdles that women face are the same hurdles that refugees face, the same hurdles that Aboriginal people face. So that's kind of the conversation. The second aspect in relation to the access to justice for women, one thing that's not ever talked about, I see in Australia, is the fact that our jails are full of Aboriginal people, but you're twice as likely to be, as an Aboriginal male, twice as likely to be imprisoned if you're female. The stats are about 40% of women in prison are Indigenous. Now, I haven't refreshed those in the last couple of years, but I'd be surprised if they changed 20% of males, and of course they're about 2% of the population. So the conversation about why women end up in that place. So in relation to the issues of the environment, I mean, I've always been involved in environmental issues. I was involved in the blockade in Tasmania in my early 20s, and then I was involved a bit in England with the Green and Common women, with protests around nuclear weaponisation of England, and also in Australia in relation to a whole range of things involving the climate and involving the failure to look after the environment, which is the same thing. It's just that at the moment we now know the impact of the failure to not looking after the environment, so the whole environment's affected. So that's work I do, and I'm actually the council that XR, Extinction Rebellion people, use in South Australia, and I've done a fair bit of work around that. You know, the interesting thing around XR is I would say that 80 to 90% of the people arrested, and maybe 60 to 70% of the membership that I meet are female, and they're female older women. And the reason for that, I think, is because, you know, we're just so fucking sick of having nothing to lose, because, you know, at every stage of a woman's life, she's silenced, and she has to shout louder, she has to stand taller, she has to achieve better to get anywhere. And so by the time you get into your 50s and 60s and 70s, you just had enough. And so they're actually a very powerful group. There was an interesting protest recently where about 12 women attended the tour down under. They were all over 65. They then exposed their breasts with, you know, slogans against Santos written in alphabetical order, and then they turned around and exposed their buttocks with "Dump Santos" written on it, because Santos is a climate destroyer and is also the major sponsor of the tour down under. So they were charged with indecent exposure, and we were going to run an argument that just showing your buttocks and breasts in public is not indecent of itself. There's a whole range of reasons. What's more indecent is the sponsorship of a tour like the tour down under, which is bicycles, by a climate destroyer. And yesterday, all the charges were withdrawn. A couple of people took cautions, but most of the charges were withdrawn with costs. So the bravery of women, I mean, I don't want to paint it as victim, because what I'm noticing in this space, I've been a lawyer now for 44, 45 years, is that women just are sick of it. You know, the reason why women's working centres, why women's legal services, why there's been special programs in the family court to recognise the destruction of families that are splitting apart, in particular Indigenous families, cause it. It's because of the advocacy and strength of women in getting themselves heard. And, you know, all the Teal candidates are women. Women are getting there. You know, they're getting their voices out there. I mean, I still think that they're not heard as much, but I don't want to sound like my whole experience is one of disempowerment. So it is of the empowering and the ability to empower, which is where the law is really important. Because the reason I did law back in, you know, my teenage years and tick that box is because I appreciated that I have advocacy skills. I did at school. I mean, I was a debater, and, you know, I was always the one that gave the thank you speeches and things. And I was an advocate for social change. I mean, I joined a whole range of organisations at high school. And this was New Zealand. And in New Zealand, of course, the other has a louder presence anyway, always has had, and certainly does now. So I thought, well, how can I utilise this skill set, the small skill set that I have, to achieve what I want, which is social justice? And then, you know, my first jobs were at Legal Services Commission, which is our legal aid body. I then went on to, you know, while I was there, do work in relation to the Tasmanian blockade. I then went overseas for a while and worked in a community legal centre in London. I then came back and worked at a private practice, who are a left-wing private practice firm who represent workers, and then went on to work at Aboriginal Legal Rights, and also worked back at the Legal Services Commission. And while at the Legal Services Commission, I started doing cases that involved, in particular, criminal matters where women were the victims of domestic violence and or had been charged as a result of self-defence or excessive self-defence, or, you know, provocation, defences that enabled them to then get acquitted in relation to what should have been non-criminal conduct in the first place. So using those skills, and then I started getting involved in, I mean, Jocelynne knows that I was involved in the Hindmarsh Island Bridge Royal Commission, where women were told they were liars by another group of women and men, and then got involved in refugee work, then went to the bar. So the interesting thing about the work that I do is that it always has a feminist aspect. And I've had students, I often have, I mentor Aboriginal law students, and I mentor young lawyers as well, and I continue to do that. And I remember one woman came into court. She was a law student, but she was in her 40s. And she said to me, I've never heard feminism spoken about in a court case. Like, she'd been watching, she'd been an associate, she'd been watching a lot. Because I think it's important to talk about, you know, violence and family matters, violence and criminal matters from a feminist perspective. And so that's what I bring. That's what I bring to it, to make sure that the understanding behind it, the backstory behind everything you do is done from the point of view of understanding gender. And the other issue I was heavily involved in was what was happening to women and children on Nauru. So I'm sure that internationally it's well known that Australia took its refugee applicants and asylum seekers, and then refugees, and parked initially families, then the men on Manus Island, and the women were being housed in tents on Nauru. And 3 of us wrote a report in relation to the sexual and physical abuse of those women. Then they were out of sight, out of mind. There are still refugee applicants and asylum seekers sitting in Nauru. They haven't released all of them. There are many, many, many in Australia who are just in temporary positions, so with no protection at all, and that's been for the last 7 or 8 years. So, but you had to bring feminism to that as well, because the women were treated. First of all, they were separated from the men. The families were often separated, not always, but often, and then they were really treated appallingly. I mean, keeping families in tents on a tropical island in, you know, desert, and I mean, it's a really dry, barren place because it was a phosphate mine for a long time. And there's all sorts of allegations now being made about corruption. So I always bring that to the table. I think it's important to do that, because you have to keep reminding those in power that we get what they're doing to us. And I think if you don't keep reminding people that we understand, they're going to keep doing it. And so that's why in all my work, I do have that agenda. And why, and it's not just, obviously, it's not just about women. It's also about minority genders, and also about minority groups. We can do terrible things in those environments. So the other thing is, it's sometimes a little hard for people that work in Indigenous organisations to talk about the elephant in the room in relation to Indigenous communities. And the elephant in the room, of course, is that one of the highest murder rates in the world is Indigenous women in the Northern Territory, and they're being murdered by Indigenous men in environments that are created by the history that Australia has with the Indigenous population. You know, the failure to recognise them, the failure to have a treaty with them, the failure to listen to them, and then the failure until the 1960s to even see them or count them. So that has an impact on men, which then has an impact on women and girls. And it's really difficult to articulate solutions in that environment. I was involved in setting up the Women's Legal Service in South Australia, and I did that on and off for 10 years working there on the board. And we got funding from the Commonwealth in relation to preventing violence and to enabling women to be better represented in the court environment. Because, you know, when they're victims, the police represent them, and the police aren't always the best. And so we funded a project where we sent lawyers to the courts on the lands when men were charged with violent offending, and women were there wanting to withdraw the charges. Because for women and families in that environment, you know, the choices are very narrow. If their man or their son or their brother or their dad gets locked up, they're seen as being the cause of that. And jails are dangerous places for Aboriginal men. So, you know, those choices are very narrow. But the only way that sometimes the violence can stop is by the women being properly informed. And so our project saw a 10% reduction in the women who were wanting to withdraw charges, which was a good thing, because then you can go on to get solutions in relation to having community-based education and support for the family. So, you know, that was also informed by my understanding of what went on in those spaces. I mean, I remember being involved in relation to some of the legal work that we were doing in Port Augusta. And a female lawyer who we'd employed up there said to me, every single female Aboriginal person I come into contact with could make a criminal injuries compensation claim. There isn't one who was a victim of violence. So the impact on women for their safety in that space is really, it's not really spoken out loud that much, but it is something that, you know, we have to address. So that's the way in which I've utilised my professional skills of advocacy and fighting to make sure that the unheard are heard, which is really women, which is really minorities. And I know that I bring that and I know I bring it to my detriment from time to time. I mean, I'm aware of that. I'm aware people don't want you to do that. They want to shut you up. And I'm aware that, I'm also aware that because I'm a silk and because I'm seen as, you know, it's only South Australia, but I'm seen as one of the outspoken people who you can go to if there's been breaches of human rights instruments here, that I enable those that come after me to think, well, if she can do it, I can do it. And so it means that people have, they become braver in this space too. And I'm aware of that responsibility that I have to my profession. And it's not just, it doesn't just impact women. I mean, I had a very interesting conversation with a white male, a bit older than me, who wanted to have lunch with me to talk to me about gender issues. Oh, here we go. But I never say no. And then he told me that he'd been invited onto the Law Society executive. Now, our Law Society, we brought in 8 years ago now, we changed the constitution to bring in quotas, much to the disappointment of many, you can imagine. Anyway, they now have problems getting enough men on board to satisfy their quotas. And so he was being invited, and he just said, look, I'm not going to do it. There's more women than male lawyers. I said, well, what did you say when you were asked? He said, oh, I think it's time for white men to shut the fuck up. And I was so floored because he's a partner in a law firm. He is a conservative style of person, but sometimes you just have to keep talking and people will get it, and not just people that you think should get it, but people who you are surprised do get it. So I see that as what my role is. I mean, only last night I was, you know, speaking at a rally to try and protect in South Australia our right to protest, because the Labor government in 7 hours changed the legislation for people that block roads from being a $750 fine to being 3 months imprisonment and a $50,000 fine. And it passed through the lower house in 7 hours, and now it's going to be debated in the upper house. But, you know, dozens of organisations have come out opposing it because they see it as silencing. And it was really good because the first half of the meeting, the first half of the rally on the steps of Parliament was done by the School Kids for Climate Action. They're just so good. And then the AFB and the unions and the Greens, and we have a party here called SA Best, and other lawyers came and spoke then, including myself, came and spoke about what the implications are of demonising an action and turning it into a criminal activity simply because you want to silence people. So, you know, I think that it's really important that people use their skills in this way and use their skills to empower women.
I was going to say thanks so much, Claire, and thank you very much for your courage, because we do recognise that you are one of these very great, courageous women that we really appreciate. Just before handing over to my colleagues, the legislation in the United Kingdom on this issue of demonstrations actually says that police can arrest if the demonstration is making a noise. So no more, what do we want, when do we want it, now, and so on. And it's totally repressive legislation. Also, if you're demonstrating anywhere near a church, that's a big no-no. There's a whole lot of provisions, but you see, it's a worldwide movement, and it's a fight back against this issue of those who haven't had voice having it. But really, there's something I did want, two things I wanted to ask you, but before you respond to that, I'll hand over to my my colleagues, but just that I see that you are on the management committee of the Working Women's Centre, and if there's anything that you could say about equal pay and the pensions gap, because the wage gap is talked about, not the pensions gap. And then the second point, how do we overcome the problem where a change is made to the law and then the judges subvert it? I'll give you an example. This is from England, but we'll all understand it. When provocation was abolished and it was changed to loss of control, the second reading speech and all the second reading debate showed clearly that claims of adulterous behaviour, that is, you know, the usual thing that the man says, oh, well, she told me she was sleeping with everybody in the street and that gives an excuse to kill her and she's dead and we don't know whether it's true or it's not. But everything said, that sort of proposition should not be allowed to be put forward as a trigger for loss of control. So Clinton goes through the court.
I don't agree with you.
Sorry.
I don't agree with you.
No, wait a minute. I just want to get to my point then.
Okay, sorry.
That Clinton goes through the court and the propositions that are put forward are that he was on the internet looking for positions to say to commit suicide, and she laughed at him. And the second one was that she said, you'll have to take care of the children now. Now, those two matters were put forward to substantiate loss of control, and he was convicted. It went to the Court of Appeal, and what was said was that contentions that she slept with everybody in the street should be allowed to put in as long as there was some other factor like this laughing about the efforts to find suicide possibilities. Now, what the court did there, my point is, whether you agree or you don't agree that adultery should be allowed as a contention for loss of control, it's not my point. My point is that it's clear from the second reading speeches what was intended by that change. And you have the Court of Appeal then overturning that and undercutting what was intended. How do we stop that from happening?
Well, there's two ways to stop that from happening. The first way is that you then get legislative change that actually tightens it up and reflects what Parliament meant. Second way is that you have better prosecution, and better prosecution at two levels. One, the cross-examination of someone who is, you know, pretending to be provoked by a particular activity and justifying it, and who was better at articulating those issues on appeal, because they're the drivers. The courts, see, the thing is, the reason why you bring in this law change in relation to provocation was because it was meant to be able to have to deal with that has to be immediate and sudden. And it was meant to be able to deal with, in fact, the way that women might be provoked in relation to activities, because women didn't have that defence available. But I really do think it comes down to the cross-examination skill set and the articulation skill set. The Parliament can turn around and say, the courts have got it wrong. This is what we meant. This is what the legislation will now say. That's the only way you can do it, really.
I suppose, though,
there's also, systemically, there's also the best way of doing it, which is to make sure that your bench adequately reflects your community. Yeah. And you look at New Zealand and you look at the statistics of who sits on the bench there, the mixture of people on the bench, and you ask yourself, well, how do they do it? And we just, we have an appeal court here in South Australia of 7 judges, 5 of whom are children of judges. We don't have diversity here. And the reason they do it better in New Zealand is you have to apply to be a judge. It's not an appointment by some attorney who wants to reward a mate. So you apply, you get interviewed, and if you don't get it, if someone else gets it and you think you're a better candidate, you can appeal it. So you're getting the best people. That's how it occurs in New Zealand. So, and I think, it's not the only country that has a transparency in relation to judicial appointments. So they're the 3 ways that you could fix that.
Right. Thank you. So over to my colleagues, and we can come back on the equal pay if you would like to comment on it. But
about that now, while I remember.
Okay. Yeah.
So the reason I'm on the board of the Working Women's Centre is because remember that fantastic report from the Human Rights Commission, Your Rights at Work.
Mm-hmm.
It's a Jocelynne, you would love it. It's a 600 or 700 page document, and it has a range of recommendations in relation to ensuring that women's rights at work are better achieved. And the recommendations included funding in each state more services for advocacy around this space. And the Working Women's Centre in South Australia got that funding. I think in the other states it was the Women's Legal Service who might have got it. But in South Australia, the Working Women's Centre got a huge amount of funding to enable them to employ lawyers to go and do work in this space. So it's equal opportunity work, but also industrial work in the industrial courts. But one of the conditions was that they had to bring more lawyers onto their board. And so I was asked if I would come on, because it's not really my area. I do discrimination work. I don't do employment. I've done some employment work, but usually where someone's left a job because of the illness caused by sexual discrimination or harassment. So I've done that. Or they've been sacked because of gender. So they're the smaller areas I've done. But and I've only been on the board for a year because that money only came through. But the recommendation, if you took every one of the recommendations that were made by the Human Rights Commission in that report, you would have gender equity in the employment world. You just would. They're fantastic recommendations.
Good, thank you. We'll take that on board. Okay, good. So over to Mary, Helen, Kerry.
I wouldn't know where to start. It was such a big and expansive area. It's very interesting to listen to. I do need to take some of this in and think about it just a little bit more.
I'd probably ask about obviously the parts around Indigenous people, especially in the Northern Territory, and helping and assisting Aboriginal women and children. How do you think things can be implemented in the NT and nationally, combating things like women and children who are suffering from violence?
Well, Aboriginal women and children have an even greater hurdle to cross in relation to being believed, but they also have to have safety options. Removing women and children from community because the offenders in the community is the wrong thing to do. You've got to make sure that the women feel supported. A lot of it has to be around education, because often it's the women's family that encourage them to withdraw charges or encourage them not to report matters. So we've got to have it's a whole of community. It's around education, it's around support for the women, it's around believing women, but also, the police service. The police service, they're not all bad, but we have an environment where the police in the Northern Territory, the federal and state police have been involved, the Territory Police have been involved in removing children from families, going in and arresting people in the middle of the night, shooting. We know, there's an acquittal by a police officer who shot someone who was wanted on not that serious charges. They're supposed to be the people that Indigenous women and children then go to help support them. So you can see there's a level of distrust. So there has to be involvement in relation to that. The Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody recommendations came down, 35 years ago. Those recommendations include recommendations that will see the end to some of these issues. And not one state or territory in Australia has implemented substantially the recommendations of the Royal Commission. The Royal Commission just wasn't about how do we make cells and police stations safer. It was about how do we stop the disengagement of Indigenous people in our society, which is causing the offending, which is causing drug and alcohol problems, etc., etc. So those sorts of issues. And I think the second thing is really in relation to women and children in the Northern Territory in particular, but it's also Western Australia, is you don't listen to people like me. You listen to community, because women and children, women and representatives of children in those environments kind of know. They do know what they can do. They do know what solutions will work. And that's why, I bang on with my colleagues who don't support the voice to talk about the voice, because that's what that will achieve. And that's what ATSIC used to do. But this will be constitutionally recognised. There won't be able to be a John Howard come along and stand it. So I really do think listening to the community, listening to the people on the ground, making sure that people are believed and giving safe options, and throwing money. It takes money, no commitment without money. So they're my, my views of what goes on in those spaces. You probably have good ideas as well.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's difficult.
And we heard from Sally Guerin yesterday on this very issue as well, the problem in the Northern Territory for Indigenous women, and that it's very difficult to have the issue come out because we understand, as you said, that it's the non-Indigenous colonisation, invasion of Australia that's created a destruction of a culture that's led to this violence. But nonetheless, the violence inflicted on the women has to be recognised in the terms that it is inflicted against them, and it needs to be stopped. But perhaps, Helen, do you have something? Yes, I can see Helen's nodding.
In terms of, Anna has said that you want to talk mostly about using law to achieve social justice as a framework. Would you be able to, and I understand that there might be difficulties here, but would you be able to speak a little bit about your own experience and of discrimination and harassment in the law, the institution of the law? And by that I think one of the things that came out was not merely the judges, as you've mentioned, but also court officers. For example, the Weinstein court officer in South Australia, who was nicknamed Weinstein or so. And again, I think you might, if you don't want to talk about it, that's fine. But I just thought it was useful in terms of understanding how the legal institution, not the laws specifically, but the legal institution works in terms of silencing, in terms of making it difficult for women in law to achieve things and to achieve things outside of law.
Look, it's impossible for me to talk about at the moment legally because
it's
by the conduct board for a Facebook post I put up where I identified gender issues in the law, and I also talked about the fact that I'd been sexually harassed by someone who was then sitting on the district court. I got prosecuted and found to have brought the profession into disrepute by the conduct board here. And then I took that on appeal. Julian Burnside was my barrister for that. And I won the appeal, and now the conduct board have appealed my winning, and that's for the full court in 2 weeks' time. So I can't really talk about my personal experience. I can talk about systemic experiences, though. So as a result of some behind-the-scenes work to do some deals with the attorney, who was then a Liberal attorney, we had the Equal Opportunity Commission in South Australia conduct a very quick 6-week inquiry into gender and the law in South Australia. As a result of that, about 40% of female lawyers contacted her, maybe 35, 40%. And the report of the Equal Opportunity Commission of Acting Commissioner Steph Halliday is amazing. As a result of that, directly as a result of that, a magistrate was then prosecuted under our Judicial Conduct Commission, and he was found guilty and was taken off the bench. As a direct result of that, the way in which associates are appointed in the district court, where a lot of sexual grooming and abuse occurred, changed without judges finding their own associate. As one of the associates said to the chief judge when she was being interviewed by him, "Did it not occur to you over the last 10 years we all look the same?" And so they brought human resources in to now interview, and judges don't pick their own associates. And now they have, surprisingly, 50% men, surprisingly women and men from a whole range of ethnic backgrounds and ages. So they're no longer tall, skinny young women. It was just notorious what was going on in that court. That practice only came into effect in the middle of last year as part of the resources in the courts. During that, one of the associates and I spent 2 hours with the chief judge of the district court and the human resources people talking about what they could do to fix things. So they did. And then 5 weeks later, at a Christmas party, 2 of the associates went, remember our induction? We were told we shouldn't have to put up with any of this behaviour. This judge is doing this. And they went and reported it. And now on Friday last week, that judge resigned because he'd been investigated for that conduct. And we all knew what he'd done. He'd done it before. But you change the system, you change the outcome. And so I was directly involved in, first of all, making sure we had an inquiry in South Australia. And secondly, I was directly involved then in the changing of the process in that space. So, you know, you can achieve, if you know how to work behind the scenes as well as up front, you can achieve change. But change affects outcome, because you know most of what the NAS report, which is a report that's about 10 years old now, that the Law Council did in Australia in relation to why women were leaving the profession, the National Attrition Research Study, NAS, what they just thought before they went in was that women were leaving because it becomes too hard when they're balancing family and children. Women were leaving because of gender issues. They were leaving because they're being harassed and they weren't getting the right amount of pay compared to their males. They went to other professions. And so then each state in Australia then slowly brought about NAS-related recommendations, including, as I said earlier, me advocating for having quotas on our local council. So as a result of that NAS report, we know that there's problems. But one interesting thing that came out of NAS, which has come out of every single research since, is the most dangerous place for a woman to be is at the bar. That's where you get paid less. So the Productivity Commission said about maybe 4 years ago now, the average female barrister in Australia earns $65,000. The average male barrister in Australia earns $180,000. It's the greatest disparity in any profession. Secondly, about 40% of women at the bar have experienced sexual harassment and sexual abuse. 40%. And if you consider the bar kind of attracts, especially in South Australia, maybe in other states because you go straight from law school, but in South Australia you have to be around a long time before you become a barrister. It attracts a kind of strong, feisty type of women. Imagine what that means about the ability of women then to advocate. So they're the kind of areas that I've been involved in. After NAS, I asked the Bar Association in South Australia, which then had 200 members, to set up a Women at the Bar committee. They opposed it. They had a meeting. They had a petition that went around to oppose it. Why you would oppose the simple setting up a Women at the Bar subcommittee of the Bar? So we have subcommittees for everything. We have a subcommittee for family, crime. We have a subcommittee for ethics. We have a subcommittee for, you know, the Law Society relationship. We just wanted a female subcommittee. And they said no. And, you know, it was really, we eventually got it, of course, because you can't shut women up. But the reality is it takes so much energy just to get on the first step of the ladder. So they're the sorts of things I can talk about, but I can't really talk about my own personal experiences of sexual abuse, sexual harassment. And the last time I was sexually abused, I was 55, and it was, you know, a member of the bench told me at a function he liked strong women. He wanted to throw me on the floor and fuck me. I mean, at a function with lots of other barristers around, the bar staff heard it. He thought I would be flattered. I mean, we shouldn't have to deal with this. It takes away from our skills.
So they've learnt nothing from the High Court example. Nothing.
Well, you see, the High Court example was you see, what's happened, the High Court example came down at the same time as our inquiry in South Australia, came down at the same time as they brought about the changes. So they did learn something. The one thing they've learned is that sometimes women are going to speak out. So what they're learning is you've got to make it difficult for them. So they're learning that.
So you continue with the same conduct and just make it more difficult in other ways. And the High Court example that we're referring to is a High Court judge who was alleged to have sexually harassed. There was an inquiry and he was found to have done that. And I should name him so that others are not implicated wrongly. It was Justice John Dyson Hayden. So go ahead, Claire, you were going to speak and I cut across you.
Not only that, they sued and they got damages, just to make that clear. But the thing is, what it does is, and there's been some research shown on this as well in New South Wales, and I'm sorry I don't have the reference for it, but the research showed that women who name their abusers, because most women won't do it. If I prosecute, I mean, if you prosecute someone who sexually harasses you in the work site as a lawyer, you're basically putting one nail in your legal coffin. It's not closing the lid, but it's never going to be easy, as I'm finding, because of the fact that I've been now before the courts really for 7 years over my minor matter, which was a Facebook post that was up for 7 hours. But so what happens with women that come forward? There's some research that shows their career does get flattened, and sometimes people are aware of that. Everyone that rings me and says, look, I've been to the Conduct Commission, I've been to the Law Society, they tell me if I report X happened to me, it will be suicide for my career. What do you think I should do? And I can't really say it wouldn't be. I mean, my experience is that it has been. And those women, those 4 associates that took Dyson Hayden on for his conduct, I think only 1 or 2 is still practicing law. I'm pretty sure not. I know not all of them are, but because what happened, and to be a High Court associate, you've got to be the top of your class. You really do. You've got to be the kind of people who at law school you'd want to, get their notes. Not the kind of thing, because mostly associates in other jurisdictions aren't that, but the High Court pick from right across Australia, and they pick the best. You think those women would have been the best. And what's happened to them? We've lost them. We lose women. We're losing good women because we abuse them.
Well, there's, of course, the Hickey case in New South Wales. This was not about harassment, but it was about maternity leave. She went on maternity leave and she returned, and her whole tranche of cases had been removed to somebody else, and she was downgraded in terms of her work. And she took the big law firm on and she won, but she's now, if this is still the case, she went into private practice for herself, setting up her own law firm. So again, the same consequence arises if you take them on in regard to other issues of industrial.
My daughter's in real estate, and she was working for a big firm in South Australia, and she went on maternity leave. She works in human resources. So she's working in the space. And when she came back, she was a team leader. When she came back, she was on the same pay, but she'd lost her team leader role. And they said to her, oh, we think you're going to go on and have another baby. We don't see the point in keeping you as a team leader, but we can't reduce your salary. That would be unlawful. But they, in fact, reduced her job. And I said, do they know your mother's a barrister and your husband's a solicitor? And she said, yes, they do. I said, well, do you want? I'm not doing anything, Mum. I'm not doing anything. And that happens. I mean, it's very hard in every job. I'm not saying the law is different. It's hard for all women everywhere because it does make your working life more difficult. So we have to stop the conduct. You can't expect it to be victim driven. And that relates also to what, and I don't know your name, but I was asking about the Northern Territory. It's the same thing, isn't it? Why are women and children expected to be the solution basis? Everybody knows what the problem is. Let's deal with the problem. So that's the same in those employment areas. But that ties in with the stuff that I'm doing at the Working Women's Centre, because what I said, we had a planning day, and I said we are not engaging Indigenous women, we're not engaging people from non-English speaking backgrounds, and we know from all the research they're going to be harassed more. We only engage people that come to us. So going out there and getting the finding out how we can get the workers to come to us and trust us to make sure that we can act for them is a real challenge. So that's going to be my project in the next couple of years while I'm on the board, is to make sure that we engage all. So it feels a bit silly to really talk about lawyers. I mean, we're privileged. Even those of us who've been harassed, we're privileged. We're a very privileged group. We're, up there in terms of income, in terms of society's expectations and status. I mean, we're not the ones who should be using up the oxygen for change. I think Germaine Greer said that until, the drug addicted prostitute has equality, we haven't got there. You start at the most vulnerable. That's why I don't talk very much in public about women. When I talk about women who are prejudiced, I don't talk about lawyers, really.
Yeah, it was Mary Kerr.
But I guess that's why I don't talk about lawyers, Mary, because I do feel, I mean, we're extraordinarily lucky, women lawyers. We are lucky. We're in an extraordinary position to be able to do what I do. What other job can you actually, make sure that people are informed about these issues? What other job would, I mean, if I was working in any other area, would I even be here this morning?
I think that I agree with you, Claire, on one level, because people do tend to misunderstand and then think, well, this woman's speaking from a position of privilege. On the other hand, we can't not speak about every single area and every position of women who are discriminated against, because that is silencing. And we all would accept that Indigenous Australian women, First Nations women are probably in the group that's the most disadvantaged. And then would come women of non-English speaking background, for example. But the point is, we should never be comparing ourselves with one another. We should actually be comparing ourselves and look at male barristers, female barristers, etc. Because otherwise we actually, in a sense, negate the fact that this is systemic throughout all categories of women. But look, it's been wonderful to have you. And are there any final questions? I see it's 11:29 now and our next witness is here. But is there any final comments you'd like to make, Claire?
No, thanks for doing this. Thanks for having the opportunity to at least articulate these issues from the point of view of women. I mean, I suppose just one final thing is that I did a stolen generation case here, and so far it's been the only successful suit for a stolen generation family member. Everyone else, there has been settlements. We've got lots of compensation schemes, but it's the only one where the judge has said it. And one thing that really struck home to me was, although my client was an Aboriginal male who'd been removed, the impact on women was great. And that was only my generation. The plaintiff in that matter was my age. And you think the impact on women who lost, and it's the same with deaths in custody, the impact on women is enormous. And that pain, and the women are the strongest people in the Indigenous community. They're the ones that I go to when I want their voice, etc. I'm not saying that men don't have strength as well. I'm just saying that I really, really respect the pain they've been through, the impact that all these thefts had on them, the theft of land, theft of culture, theft of children. And so I just wanted to end with that.
I can talk normally if you want. We'll take this off.
Thank you, Claire. Could others please turn off your microphone? Please turn off your microphone, other people. Thank you. Sorry for that, Claire. It's been wonderful to have you. We very much appreciate it. And, well, there you are in Adelaide, and I must get you on to talk with my students at the University of Buckingham sometime when it's possible to link up because of the time difference, or if you're in London. Yeah. No, I wasn't saying you turn off your microphone. I was saying others.
Could I just add too, thank you for talking briefly about your experience. And I know that there's not one person on this table that doesn't support you.
Oh, you've made my day. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.